Ethan Granger was once a man who lived for the thrill of saving lives. He had dedicated his entire career to wildlife rescue, spending countless hours at the Colorado Wildlife Rescue Center, where he earned the admiration of his colleagues and the affection of the animals under his care. His reputation was built on his ability to perform intricate surgeries on creatures that many believed were beyond saving. He worked tirelessly, always pushing the limits of what he could do, always striving to make a difference. But that was before the accident, before the night that everything changed. It had been a quiet evening when the phone call came. Ethan had just finished a long day at the center, a day filled with routine checkups and mundane tasks. His younger brother, Daniel, had been working alongside him, an eager apprentice learning the ropes of veterinary care. Daniel had always looked up to Ethan, seeing him as a hero, someone capable of doing the impossible. But that evening, Daniel had been the one to make the call. "There's a situation," Daniel had said over the phone, his voice strained. "We've got a bear, an adult male with a compound fracture in his leg. He's been hit by a car. They're bringing him in, but the situation's bad. We need to operate now or he won't survive the night." Ethan had hesitated. The bear was massive, its injury severe, but they had the experience and the tools to save him. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he had said, already grabbing his coat and keys. He could hear the urgency in his brother's voice, and that alone pushed him to act faster than he normally would. The world outside was already slipping into darkness, but to Ethan it felt as if the world was closing in, trapping him in the grip of a decision he could not undo. The surgery was supposed to be routine for someone with Ethan's skill. He had performed countless operations in his time at the rescue center, each one a testament to his ability to save lives. He had always been the one who could see beyond the blood and pain of the situation, focusing solely on the animal and the mission at hand. This time, however, something was different. The moment the anesthesia had been administered and the bear had been wheeled into the operating room, Ethan had felt a wave of unease he could not shake, the feeling that something was wrong. Daniel, ever the optimist, had stood by his side, eager to help. It was supposed to be simple, a routine fracture repair, but as the bear's leg was exposed, Ethan noticed something unsettling. The bone was shattered, far worse than anyone had anticipated. As he prepared to set the bone and insert the necessary pins, the bear's vitals began to drop. Ethan's heart raced as the bear's blood pressure plunged. The bear's massive body thrashed against the restraints, sending waves of panic through the room. Daniel, ever the steady one, had shouted instructions, but Ethan couldn't focus. His hands shook as he tried to stabilize the animal, trying to stop the bleeding and reset the bone, but the damage was too extensive. It was the kind of situation that made even the most seasoned veterinarians question whether they could succeed. In the chaos that followed, Ethan had looked to Daniel for guidance. His younger brother had always been the calming influence, the one who could think clearly in moments of crisis. But when he turned to Daniel that night, what he saw was a face filled with horror. Daniel had tried to help, his hands moving quickly, but then, as the tension reached its peak, the inevitable happened. The bear, in his frantic struggle, jerked violently, and in the midst of the confusion, Daniel had been thrown off balance. He had tripped over the table, his body crashing into the edge of the operating room, his head striking the hard floor with a sickening thud. For a moment, Ethan had been frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He rushed to his brother's side, but it was already too late. The sound of Daniel's breath, labored and shallow, was the only thing Ethan could hear in that moment. The room had fallen eerily silent, the chaos of the surgery forgotten in the face of something far worse. The bear's cries of pain were now drowned out by the frantic pounding of Ethan's own heart as he tried to revive his brother, to bring him back, but the life was already slipping away, leaving Ethan helpless and broken. When the paramedics arrived, it was clear there was nothing they could do. Daniel had suffered a traumatic brain injury, and despite their best efforts, he had passed away before they could even get him to the hospital. Ethan had been left standing in the cold, sterile operating room, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. The bear, which had initially been the focus of their attention, now lay forgotten on the operating table, its fate no longer important in the face of this tragic loss. The weeks that followed were a blur. The rescue center had sent condolences, and his colleagues had tried to comfort him, but none of it mattered. Ethan had abandoned the center, abandoning his career and the life he had known for so long. The guilt that weighed on him was suffocating. He couldn't escape the images of that night, the frantic surgery, his brother's terrified face, the helplessness in Daniel's eyes as he slipped away. The worst part was that Ethan had been the one to decide to go ahead with the surgery. He had been the one to make the call, to save the bear, to risk everything for one more life. And in doing so, he had lost the most important person in his life. With the center behind him and his brother gone, Ethan had retreated to a secluded cabin deep in the Colorado wilderness. It was a place far removed from the chaos of the world, a place where he could hide from the memories that tortured him. The cabin was small, rustic, and isolated, a perfect refuge from the life he no longer wanted. He spent his days in silence, chopping wood, fixing the small leaks in the roof, and taking long walks in the snow-covered forest. The cabin was his sanctuary, and yet it was also a prison. The silence was deafening. There was no one to talk to, no one to help him make sense of the tragedy that had taken everything from him. As the years passed, the isolation seemed to have its effect. Ethan's once brilliant mind, sharp and focused on the well-being of animals, had dulled. He hadn't touched a scalpel in years, hadn't saved a single life since that fateful night. His heart, once filled with compassion for the creatures he cared for, had become a hollow shell. The grief was all-consuming, gnawing at him until it felt like there was nothing left. But even in the depths of his despair, something inside Ethan still yearned for the work he had left behind. Deep down, he knew that he wasn't just running from the memories of Daniel's death, he was running from his own guilt, his own inability to save the one person who had meant the most to him. It was easier to shut everything out, to live in the quiet of the cabin, and forget about the world outside. Easier, but not fulfilling. Ethan's life had become a series of routines. He woke up every morning at dawn, made a pot of coffee, and spent the rest of the day in solitude. He tried to forget about the past, but it always lingered, like a shadow following him wherever he went. Sometimes, when the silence was too much to bear, he would take a walk through the woods, listening to the sound of his boots crunching through the snow. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape the memories. They were always there, waiting for him when he returned to the cabin. Ethan had learned to live with the pain, or at least to ignore it. He didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone. The world had taken his brother, and in return, he had taken himself out of it. The days bled together, each one a reflection of the last, until it felt like time itself had stopped. The man who had once been at the forefront of wildlife rescue was now a shell, barely holding on to the life he had once known. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, Casting a golden hue across the snow-dusted trees surrounding his cabin, Ethan Granger sat by his window, staring into the distant wilderness. The forest had a way of making everything feel so small, so insignificant, and Ethan often found comfort in that thought. It was as though the woods didn't care about the burdens he carried. Yet that morning, something felt different. There was a shift in the air, a sense of urgency that he couldn't quite shake. The peaceful stillness of his isolated life was disrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. At first, Ethan hesitated. Who could possibly be out here, so far from civilization, in the middle of nowhere? He glanced at the clock. It was still early, too early for visitors. Yet the knock came again, louder this time. A voice called out, muffled by the thick wood of the door. "Mr. Granger. Mr. Granger. We need your help." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. He had heard it years ago, back when he still worked at the rescue center. A familiar voice he had grown used to during his time with the animals. It was Julia Myers, the director of the Boulder Zoo. Ethan had never been particularly close to her, but he respected her dedication to animal welfare. She was one of the few people who had understood the sacrifices Ethan made for his work. But why was she here, in this desolate part of the world? And what could she possibly need from him now? With a reluctant sigh, Ethan rose from his chair and made his way to the door. The knock sounded again, more insistent this time. He could feel his pulse quicken as he reached for the handle, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he considered turning back, slamming the door, and retreating to his life of solitude. But something within him, a flicker of the man he once was, compelled him to open it. When he did, he found Julia standing on his porch, her face flushed from the cold, her breath visible in the crisp air. Beside her stood a young woman, her features soft and round, with wide, hopeful eyes that seemed to search Ethan for answers. It was her gaze that stopped him in his tracks. The woman, a girl, really couldn't have been much older than 18. Yet there was something in the way she looked at him, a quiet desperation, a plea that stirred something in his chest. "Ethan," Julia said, her voice steady but strained. "This is my daughter, Ellie. We need your help." Ethan took a step back, instinctively retreating into the shadows of his cabin as though trying to hide from the reality of the situation. I don't think I can help you. I'm not that man anymore," he muttered, his voice cracking as the words left his lips. He didn't recognize this version of himself, the one who had given up, the one who had left behind everything that had once mattered. But Julia's gaze was unwavering, and Ellie's eyes seemed to pierce through him, as if they could see past his walls, past the years of guilt and regret. "You're the only one who can help," Julia continued, her tone softer now, more urgent. "We've got a situation at the zoo. A bear. His leg is shattered. Ethan, it's bad. The other vets have refused to operate. They say he won't survive the surgery. They're calling it a lost cause. But Ellie..." She paused, glancing at her daughter before continuing. "Ellie won't give up on him. She raised him, Ethan. She found him when he was just a cub, abandoned in the snow. And she's not ready to let him go. Please." Ellie stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Ethan's, silently pleading with him. "You don't understand. His name is Bramble. He's not just any bear. He's family. He was mine, and I can't lose him. Not like this." Ethan's heart tightened as he met Ellie's gaze. He saw in her eyes the same determination he had once felt, The same fire that had driven him to be the best veterinarian he could be, the same hope he had carried with him when he first started his work. He hadn't seen that kind of hope in years, not since Daniel had died. But looking at Ellie now, something stirred within him, a quiet whisper from the past, a reminder of who he had been before the tragedy. "I can't help you," Ethan repeated, his voice barely a whisper, barely a breath. I don't do this anymore. I can't." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, each syllable more final than the last. Julia's expression softened. She understood. Ethan had given up, and she knew why. She didn't need to ask him why he had retreated, why he had walked away from a career he had once loved. She had seen the toll it had taken on him, the way he had crumbled beneath the weight of guilt. But that didn't change the fact that Bramble needed him, and Ellie needed him. "I know it's hard, Ethan," Julia said, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "I know you've been through so much. But Ellie can't do this alone. She can't lose him. Not after everything." Ethan looked at Ellie again, and for the first time in years, he saw something other than the darkness that had clouded his mind. He saw a reflection of his younger self, the man who had once believed in the impossible, the man who had been fearless in the face of a challenge. He saw a woman desperate to save a creature she loved, willing to do whatever it took to make sure Bramble didn't die alone. The thought of abandoning her, of walking away, felt wrong. But so did the thought of stepping back into a life he had left behind. He was afraid that if he failed, if he couldn't save Bramble, it would only reinforce the guilt he had carried for so long. But as he looked at the hope in Ellie's eyes, the faint glimmer of trust in her expression, he realized that he couldn't turn his back. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let another life slip away without trying to save it. With a heavy sigh, Ethan finally stepped aside, allowing Julia and Ellie to enter the cabin. "I'll help you," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But I'm not the man I used to be. Don't expect miracles." Ellie's face lit up with a mix of relief and gratitude, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him, something that wasn't pain or regret, but hope. Just a flicker, but enough to remind him that perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't as lost as he had believed. Julia smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, Ethan. You don't know how much this means to us." Ethan nodded, then turned toward the old barn behind his cabin. "I'll need to clear out the space. We'll need a sterile area to operate. We can't risk infection. And I'll need supplies. We'll have to do this as quickly as possible." Ellie followed him, her footsteps light as she trailed behind, the weight of the world momentarily forgotten in her determination. She was going to do everything she could to help Bramble. Ethan, too, would give whatever he had left to save the bear. There was a part of him that wasn't ready to let go of the past, but for the first time in years, he felt a small spark of the man he used to be, the man who had saved lives, who had made a difference. Maybe, just maybe, he could still do that again. And so, with the old barn transformed into a makeshift operating room, Ethan Granger began the slow process of rediscovering the part of himself that had been buried beneath the weight of guilt and isolation. The bear named Bramble was just the beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity and emotion, but for Ethan Granger, they marked a turning point. Though he didn't know it yet, the barn, which had once stood as a silent reminder of his retreat from life, was transformed into a makeshift surgical suite, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and the hum of equipment. It had been a long time since he'd prepared for an operation, and as he gathered his tools and set up the sterile environment, his hands shook, not from the cold, but from the memories that came rushing back. His mind constantly flickered between the present moment, where Ellie's unwavering hope and Julia's quiet persistence gave him a reason to act, and the shadow of the past, the time when his brother Daniel's life had slipped through his fingers. The guilt and the self-loathing that had haunted him for so many years were still there, lurking at the edges of his thoughts. But for the first time in a long while, they seemed a little quieter. Ellie had given him something he hadn't known he'd lost: purpose. Ellie's bond with Bramble was undeniable. The bear was more than just a patient to her. He was family. Ethan had seen the way she cared for him, the way she spoke to him softly as though he could understand every word. The bond between them was something rare, something that went beyond simple human connection. It was a relationship that reminded Ethan of the days when he had cared for his patients with the same level of devotion. He watched Ellie as she sat in the corner of the barn, her eyes fixed on Bramble, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. Her presence was calming, and Ethan could tell that the bear felt it too. Despite the severity of his injury, Bramble remained still, listening to her voice as though it was the only thing that mattered. As Ellie continued to speak, Ethan gathered his thoughts and readied himself for the task ahead. He had to focus. The operation would be delicate, and there was little room for error. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he failed, it wouldn't just be Bramble who suffered, it would be Ellie too. The pressure of that responsibility was immense, but something deep within him told him he couldn't back down now, not when they were depending on him, not when Ellie had placed her trust in him. Ethan had spent so long hiding from the world, running from the pain of his past, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to be a part of something bigger than himself. This moment, this decision, could be the beginning of his redemption. As he moved into position, the door to the barn creaked open and Julia entered. Her face was tired, and the bags beneath her eyes were a testament to the sleepless nights she'd spent worrying about Bramble's survival. But when she saw Ethan preparing, her face softened. She said nothing. There was no need for words. The trust between them had always been unspoken, built on years of shared experiences in the world of wildlife rescue. She knew Ethan was capable, and deep down, so did he. He just had to believe it himself. The procedure began, and as Ethan worked, he could feel the old instincts coming back to life. The steady rhythm of the surgery, the careful precision of each incision, the focus required to save a life. These were the things that had once filled his days with meaning. The tools in his hands felt familiar again, not foreign. With every passing moment, he felt more connected to the man he used to be. And yet, as much as he focused on the task at hand, part of him couldn't help but notice Ellie's gaze on him. Her eyes were filled with hope. It was a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. His fingers moved with practiced grace, but in the back of his mind, memories of Daniel's last moments flashed before him. The bear's condition was precarious, but as the surgery progressed, Ethan's focus never wavered. Ellie's presence, like a beacon, kept him grounded, reminding him that this wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about redeeming the piece of him that had been lost, about healing the wounds that time had not. The clock ticked slowly, but the operation finally neared its end. Ethan's hands were steady as he closed the wound, carefully stitching Bramble's leg with the precision that had once been his trademark. The bear was still sedated, but Ethan could already see signs that the surgery had been a success. The leg was aligned correctly, the fracture had been set, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, Ethan allowed himself to believe that Bramble could heal. As the final stitch was tied, Ethan stepped back and looked down at the bear, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The weight of the operation still lingered, but there was no denying that this moment marked a shift, a turning point in his journey, both for Bramble and for himself. Ellie was the first to approach the bear. She knelt beside him, her hands gently brushing his fur as she spoke to him softly, her voice a calming presence in the barn. "You did great, Bramble. You're going to be okay," she whispered, her fingers tracing the contours of his massive body. Ethan watched as a silent observer to the intimate bond between the two. He had seen many animals healed over the years, but something about this moment felt different. This wasn't just a medical procedure, this was about hope. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to believe in it. The bear would survive. Ellie would have her companion back, and Ethan, though still burdened by his past, could see a path forward, one that didn't involve retreat, but rather renewal. As the day wore on and the barn fell silent, save for the occasional sound of Bramble shifting in his sleep, Ethan stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like he was suffocating. The mountains loomed large around him, their peaks still dusted with the remnants of snow, and the forest stretched out endlessly. The quiet of the world was both peaceful and isolating, but in this moment, it felt like a sanctuary. Ethan had spent so long running from the world, from his own guilt, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be at peace with himself. He had spent years convinced that he was beyond redemption, that the loss of Daniel had taken too much from him for him to ever heal. But as he looked out at the vast wilderness around him, something shifted within him. He wasn't alone, not anymore. He had Ellie, Julia, and the animals he had once dedicated his life to saving. He had a chance to rebuild, to reclaim the man he had been before the tragedy. He wasn't sure how long it would take or what it would look like, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stirring deep inside, a flicker of hope that had been buried under layers of guilt and grief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that life could still have meaning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and purple, Ethan returned to the barn. Ellie was still by Bramble's side, her voice soft as she spoke to the bear. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, and for the first time, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was no longer running, he was healing. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that it wasn't too late to save himself. As the weeks passed, the world outside Ethan's cabin began to shift. The mountain air grew crisper, the trees shed their autumn colors, and the first signs of winter began to take hold. The once barren barn, now a place of healing, had become a sanctuary, not only for Bramble but for Ethan as well. The bear, though still recovering, was showing signs of strength. He had started to move more freely, testing his leg with cautious steps that brought a quiet sense of triumph to Ethan's heart. Ellie remained by his side every day, her presence a constant source of reassurance, both for the bear and for Ethan. As Bramble regained his strength, Ethan's own began to follow suit. He had spent so long locked away in the prison of his guilt, hiding from the world, from himself, that he had forgotten the feeling of purpose. But watching Ellie and Bramble, seeing their bond deepen each day, made something inside him stir. It was like a door had cracked open, letting in a little light after years of darkness. He began to feel the stirrings of the man he used to be, the man who had once believed in the impossible, the man who had been able to help, to heal, the man who had once saved lives and who had been saved in turn by his work. The days had become routine, but not the kind of routine that weighed heavily on him. No longer did the silence of his cabin feel suffocating. It had become a companion, one that allowed him the space to reflect, to rebuild. Each morning, he would wake before the sun, prepare the barn for Bramble's next round of physical therapy, and then spend hours observing, tending to, and helping the bear heal. At first, the work had been difficult, his hands unsure, the familiar motions of the past tinged with uncertainty. But as time went on, his confidence returned. Each small success, Bramble standing a little longer, taking a few more steps, was a victory for both of them. It was clear that the bear had begun to trust Ethan, just as Ethan had slowly started to trust himself again. Ellie continued her role as Bramble's dedicated caretaker, speaking to him softly and keeping him calm during the long hours of rehabilitation. Her love for the bear was a thing of quiet, fierce devotion, and Ethan couldn't help but admire it. It reminded him of the bond he had shared with Daniel, the way his younger brother had looked up to him, the way they had worked together to heal animals, to save them from pain. That bond, though broken by tragedy, had never truly vanished. It had been buried, forgotten, but it was beginning to resurface. One evening, as the sky faded into twilight and the barn was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, Ethan found himself sitting outside, watching Bramble as he walked around the small enclosure, testing his leg with each cautious step. The bear was nearly back to his full strength. The sight of Bramble moving freely as he once had brought a sense of fulfillment that Ethan hadn't known he needed. Ellie sat beside him, her face illuminated by the fading light, her eyes soft as she watched Bramble. They sat in silence for a while, the air filled only with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional grunt from Bramble as he explored his surroundings. Finally, Ellie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Ethan." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He had never been one for words, especially words of gratitude, but something about Ellie's sincerity, the quiet depth of her voice, made his heart swell. He had saved Bramble's life, yes, but in the process, he realized that he had saved something in himself too. "You don't have to thank me," Ethan said, his voice gruff with emotion. "It wasn't just me. You never gave up on him, Ellie. You believed when everyone else had given up." She nodded, her eyes still fixed on Bramble. "I had to. He's not just an animal to me, Ethan. He's my family. And I think I saw something in you, too. I saw the man who used to care, who used to fight for what was right." Ethan looked at her then, his gaze steady but heavy with unspoken words. He didn't know if he had ever truly cared for himself the way he cared for the animals he saved, but he knew now that Ellie had given him the courage to try. "I'm not the same man I was," he said softly. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe the man I was isn't who I need to be anymore." Ellie smiled, her eyes bright. "Maybe. But you're still capable of saving lives. Don't forget that." As the evening wore on and the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Ethan stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. The work was far from over. Bramble still had a long road ahead of him, and there was still much to do. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was moving forward. He turned to Ellie, his voice quieter now. "Tomorrow, we'll take him outside. Let him roam a little. He's ready." Ellie's face lit up. "Really? Ethan nodded. He's come a long way, and so have we. The next day, they led Bramble out of the barn, the bear walking with surprising strength for an animal who had once been on the brink of death. Ellie, beaming with pride, walked beside him, her hand resting gently on his massive back. Bramble's eyes were calm, his movements steady, and as he took his first steps into the open field, Ethan could see the spark of freedom in his eyes. The sun shone down on them, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The world felt vast and full of possibilities. For a moment Ethan stood still, watching the bear and the young woman who had saved him. The bond between them was a testament to the power of love, of care, of second chances. It was the same kind of bond that had once existed between Ethan and Daniel. The memory of his brother flooded him, but this time it wasn't a source of pain. It was a reminder of the man he used to be, the man he could still become. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The healing process for Bramble had been just as much about healing Ethan as it had been about the bear. As Bramble roamed freely in the field, Ellie by his side, Ethan realized that it wasn't just the animals who needed saving. It was people, too. He had thought he was beyond redemption, beyond repair, but in helping Bramble, he had rediscovered a part of himself. He wasn't sure where the path would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to walk it. There was still work to be done, still healing to be had, but as he watched Ellie and Bramble, a profound sense of peace settled within him. Ethan had saved a bear, but in the process, he had saved himself. The sunset bathed the world in golden light, and as Bramble stood tall in the field, looking toward the horizon, Ethan felt something stir inside him, hope. It wasn't too late. He wasn't too far gone. There was still a chance for him to heal, just as there was still a chance for every life, human or animal, to be saved. And as the day came to a close, Ethan stood at the edge of the field, watching the bear walk freely, with a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Granger felt at home.